12. Today we are doing the first of the essay questions in chapter 13, which is the effects of tourism on the economy. This is on page 112 of your textbook. Okay, so we are going to look at the effects of tourism on the economy relating to specific aspects of the economy. So the first aspect of the economy that we're going to be looking at is the GDP. What effect does tourism have on the GDP of South Africa? Okay, now you'll think back to one of the previous lessons where I said that the tourist industry is basically service-based. It is a service industry. So obviously the tourist industry is going to impact more on the service industry than, for example, agricultural manufacturing. All right, but although we did say that tourism is a very wide activity. Yes, it is a service industry, but also remember we said part of tourism would be the people that provide the food, the farmers that create the food that is going to be sold at the restaurants to the tourists. It includes, for example, the transport, etc. It's very wide, but most of the components of tourism will fall under the service industry. So obviously its impact in terms of the GDP impact, it's going to impact more on the tertiary sector, which is your service industry, than on agriculture, which is primary sector, or manufacturing, that is secondary sector. All right. Although I did say just now that agriculture does provide food to the restaurants, and the manufacturing industry provides vehicles that are used for transport. The manufacturing industry manufactures the suitcases that are bought by the tourists. There are upstream effects. It does impact on the secondary and the primary sectors as well, but the biggest impact will be on the tertiary sector. Okay, so we say basically that tourism will affect the GDP both directly and indirectly. All right, so when we look at the direct and the indirect and induced contribution that is made by tourism to the GDP, the direct impact would be by the tourist itself, the tourist industries, the public sector, everybody that is directly involved in tourism. Okay, your indirect investment or indirect effect will come from investments that is made by the government or the private sector, as well as purchases from suppliers. Okay, I'm going to explain this in more detail just now. All right. And then the induced benefits to the GDP is spending by direct and indirect employees. So people that are directly involved in the tourist industry will earn a salary. People that are indirectly involved in the tourist industry will earn a salary. And those people are earning salaries purely because of the tourist industry. So they're spending the money that they're earning and spending is part of the induced contribution to the GDP. Right. So the tourist industry itself, near the hotels, the accommodation, the people providing the transport, the restaurants where they purchase things, that will be the direct contribution. Indirect will be the institutions that provide the direct tourist industry with things, like the farmer that provides food to the restaurant. The restaurant will be direct. The farmer providing the food, cultivating the food will be indirect. All right. And then obviously the employees that is paid, their spending will be the induced expenditure. Okay, so there's your explanation. Your direct contribution of travel and tourism is the spending on travel and tourism by residents and non-residents. Remember, we have domestic tourists as well as international tourists. So anybody that is traveling and is qualified as tourism, need at least one night, a maximum 160 kilometers away from their normal environment. They are spending money there on participating in activities, etc., etc. Okay, so any tourist activities by local people, domestic tourists or foreign tourists, any spending of these people, any spending of the tourists on, for example, accommodation, right? The places where they need to stay, the hotels where they're going to stay, the B&Bs, the chalets that they stay in, any accommodation that they pay for, any food that they buy, whether it is at the restaurant, whether it's at the hotel, whether it's at a takeaway place, any food that tourists spend money on, any retail, okay, so stuff that tourists buy, gift shops, the stuff that they buy, the handbags that they buy, the suitcases that they buy, the camera equipment that they buy, anything they buy, curios, anything that they buy Retail is commercial services, buying and selling. Any money that they spend on transport, so their aeroplane tickets, their Uber, what they spend on the Uber, taxis that they might make use of, any transport services that they spend on, and any destination services. So anything that they pay for once they reach their destination. If they're participating in activities and they spend money, for example, they go up Table Mountain, that is going to cost them money. That money is included as the direct contribution. Money spent when tourists are going to Robben Island to see Madiba Sal. That kind of spending will be destination services. If they pay to ride a rickshaw in Durban, that is part of their destination services. Any activities that they are participating in that is costing them money, that spending will be included as part of the direct contribution. Right, from the public sector's side, any spending by the government that is linked directly to visitors. For example, the money that the government will spend on museums or recreational services, parks, the national parks, the upkeep of the Kruger National Park, for example. Right. So direct expenditure is the expenditure of tourists on tourist-related services. Okay, any money that is directly spent by tourists on whatever they spend that money on, that will be the direct contribution. Then the indirect contribution is any spending by people that will supply goods and services to the tourist destinations. All right. So, for example, it will include investment spending by the government and the private sector. For example, when we buy new aircraft, when an airline buys new aircraft to make the traveling for tourists more convenient. The building of new hotels, the building of new resorts, upgrading of water and sanitation. Any investment spending by the government, if they upgrade the roads, if they upgrade the harbors, the airports, that is investment spending that is related to the tourist industry, as well as the private sector. If I decide I'm going to build a new hotel, I'm going to build a new holiday resort, I'm going to build a new restaurant that caters for these tourists. All of these things will be part of the indirect contribution. We are spending money to improve the infrastructure to attract the tourists to come. It's not directly for tourism, it is an indirect contribution. Then it also includes any purchases from suppliers of goods and services from those sectors that deals directly with the tourist. Okay, so for example, when the hotels needs to buy new bedding, they buy the bedding from somebody. Okay, the supplier of the bedding makes an indirect contribution. Those linen are being bought for the tourist industry. Okay, the tourists are not buying the linen, but the hotels are buying the linen so that they can have nice beds and stuff for the tourists when they come. When the hotels buy new beds, when the hotels buy food, they buy the apples from the apple farmer. All of this is an indirect contribution. Okay, you'll see the purchasing of cleaning services by the hotels. The hotel rooms needs to be cleaned. Okay, they will hire it out, the cleaning services, right? Fuel, catering services by the airlines. Somebody supplies them with the food. Travel agents, the services that they provide to get the tourists here. All of that will be an example of the indirect contribution. It's not directly supplying tourists, but it is supplying the tourist destination with stuff that ultimately the tourist is going to spend money on. Right, and then the last one, the induced contribution, that measures the spending of people that are directly or indirectly employed by the travel and tourism industry. Okay, so it's an increase in a consumer spending that results from the income that people are earning through tourism. Okay, so for example, there will be a hotel worker. There's a worker that works at reception. That worker is going to earn a wage or a salary providing a service to the tourist industry, and that hotel worker will use that salary to buy consumer goods and services, to pay his kids' school fees, to buy new shoes for his children, to pay his rent. Okay, and that will be the induced contribution. It's induced because it wouldn't have happened. That spending would not have happened if the worker did not earn an income, and the worker would not earn an income if it wasn't for the tourist industry. Okay, so it's not a direct spending by the tourists, but it's spending because of tourism. All right, now if we look at the actual percentages, our indirect contribution, obviously I said that tourism is a service-based industry, And our service industry is the fastest growing. It's by far, it makes the biggest contribution to the GDP. And by service sector, remember, we mean the tertiary sector. The tertiary sector is by far the biggest contributor to the GDP. In developing economies, if we make a comparison, the tertiary sector is responsible for around 40% of the GDP. And in developed countries, it is responsible for about 65% of the GDP. Now, in South Africa, although we are a developing country, we are not a developed country, but if we looked at the contribution made by the service industry, we see that it's about 67%. That was back in 2011. This percentage isn't changing much. It's 60-something percent. It will be between 60 and 70% of our GDP that is coming from the tourist industry. All right, in terms of the direct contribution, okay, now to really plan for the development of tourist industry, obviously it is important that we know how big the tourist industry is. Now we need to be able to measure the contribution, the direct contribution of tourism to the economy. Now, Statistics South Africa shows us that in 2010, our inbound tourists, in other words, these are foreign tourists from other countries that come into South Africa to travel, they contributed around 69 billion rand. And our domestic tourists, in other words, people traveling around in our own country, contributed about 99 billion. So in total, it was 168 billion, and that represented about 3% of the GDP. And if we literally add the indirect contribution of only tourism, remember here we referred to the entire tertiary sector. This is not only tourism. If we include the indirect contribution of only tourism, it adds about 7% of the GDP. Now, I know it doesn't sound a hell of a lot, but there's very many different industries in our country. And tourism, just one industry, contributes 7% of the GDP. That is quite a significant contribution. And as I said, it is growing. Not at the moment because of COVID, but it generally, the trend is for the contribution of tourism to actually increase over time. Okay, so that is the contribution that tourism makes to the GDP, right? The second aspect of the economy that we're going to look at is employment. Okay, so in other words, what is the contribution that tourism makes to employment, to relieve unemployment in our country? Now, tourism has a major effect on unemployment. You'll see that directly and indirectly, 9% of our employed people were in the tourism industry, either making a direct contribution or an indirect contribution. And in 2011, that amounted to around 1.18 million workers. That is a significant amount of people that are involved in the tourist industry. All right. Now, why is tourism such a big generator of jobs? Now, you'll see that it's the world's largest generator of jobs. So out of all the industries that exist, tourism creates more jobs than any other industry in the world, not just in South Africa. All right. So why is it possible for tourism to create so many jobs? Okay. There's 4 reasons. Okay. First reason there is that tourism is labor intensive. In other words, jobs are being done by people. In the tourist industry, it is not possible for people to be replaced by machinery. It is a labor-intensive industry, which means people are being employed to service the tourists. All right. It has a very low ratio of investment to employment creation. This means that with every unit of capital that is invested, every, let's say, 100 rand or whatever, a certain amount of money is invested in tourism, a lot of jobs can be created. Okay, so we don't need, in other words, a very high amount of capital investment. We don't need a lot of money to be invested in order to create jobs. All right, like for example in manufacturing, in order to create jobs in manufacturing, we first have to build a factory. There has to be a money expenditure, a large expenditure to build the factory before we can employ workers. But in the case of tourism, that is not always necessary. With a small amount of capital invested, we are able to create quite a few jobs. All right, which means that many tourist activities are within the reach of small operators. It's not only people that has a large amount of money to invest that can get involved in tourism. Small little people, small entrepreneurs with a small amount of capital is able to get involved in tourism because it doesn't need a huge investment. So it's easier for people to get involved in tourism. So jobs can be created relatively easily and relatively cheaply. All right. Then the tourist industry also employs many different skills. All right. Because the tourist industry is so very, very wide, it's an extremely wide industry. It caters for almost any skill in the tourist industry. If you think from accountants, hotels obviously need to manage their finances, right? So they need accountants to make sure to balance the books, hairdressers, tour guides, trackers to track the animals. The tourist industry, there's multiple skills, dancing, cultural activities. People want to go to the hotel, they want to see Zulu dancing. So people that has a skill of dancing, it creates a job for those people. All right. So it's very skills based. Okay, and you don't have to have extremely high levels of skills. You don't need to have a university degree and an honors degree and a doctor's degree to get involved in the tourist industry. People can get involved into tourism with no qualifications at all, as long as they have a skill that is valuable in the tourist industry. Plus, the potential for on-the-job training is significant. You don't need a qualification. We train you on the job. We employ an unskilled worker. We show you how it works. We show you what we want you to do. So the potential for on-the-job training is significant. So what is important is that it creates jobs for those vulnerable people in the economy, the people that don't necessarily have skills, that find it very difficult to find a job in any other industry. Okay. Then tourism can also provide immediate employment. Okay, so it's not a question of it's going to take us 10 years to provide employment. Within a short amount of time, we are able to create quite a few jobs. All right, so the example there, if 1/4 of tourist accommodation establishments, the hotels, the B&Bs or whatever, the accommodation people, if only 1/4 of them starts to offer live entertainment, okay, whether it's people just playing live music, entertainers, people playing live music on a Friday night, offering Zulu dances around the campfire, etc., etc. If they start to offer live entertainment, thousands of entertainers could be employed within days. Okay, we don't need a huge capital investment. We just say, okay, well, every weekend we are going to provide live entertainment, and thousands of different entertainers, singers, dancers, magicians, anybody can get a jobs almost instantly, within a couple of days. And then last reason why it's so suitable to create a lot of jobs is that tourism provides entrepreneurial opportunities. The tourist industry lends itself to entrepreneurial opportunities, okay, both in the formal and the informal sector, but mostly in the informal sector, because remember I said it is skills based. You don't need a large amount of capital. So it can accommodate informal sector opportunities, arts and crafts. People working with their hands, they are very creative. They make arts and crafts, fruit vendors, pavement vendors, on the beach, people rent out chairs and umbrellas, etc., etc. Okay, it opens opportunities for a small entrepreneur with a small amount of money and a small investment to start a business of his own and then obviously employ other people. Okay, now many economists believe that the multiplier in the tourist industry is even bigger. The multiplier effect on tourism is bigger than, for example, government spending. Okay, because remember, tourism to a large extent does bring injections into the country, especially when it's foreign tourism. All right, this is because your tourist spending happens through so many different sources. It's not just one thing that people are spending money on, right? They spend on accommodation, they spend on food and beverages, they shop at our retailers, they buy curios, they buy gifts, they pay for entertainment, they pay for transport. It provides income for the hotel staff, anybody that's directly, indirectly involved in the tourist industry, the suppliers of goods and services. It just affects so many different industries that jobs can be created in many different industries. Jobs are created at hotels and other forms of accommodation. Jobs are created by restaurants and shops and entertainers and transport, taxi drivers, hotel staff, the cleaners, the receptionists, the cooks in the kitchen, the waiters in the restaurants, taxi operators, shopkeepers, the farmers. They can employ more farm workers because they are planting more stuff because we need to supply the restaurants with food for the tourists. Okay, so the focus in tourism currently is for the government to focus on the potential of entrepreneurship. All right, because we have such a high level of unemployment in the country, we want to focus on supporting small little entrepreneurs so that we can create jobs for historically disadvantaged people. And then marginalized people can get involved and reap the benefits of tourism as well. Okay,